On May 1, 1960, U-2 pilot Gary Powers was shot down and captured by Soviets in Soviet Union airspace. Confronted with the evidence of his spying, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was forced to admit to the Soviets that the U.S.'s CIA had been flying spy missions over the USSR for several years. The Soviets convicted Powers of espionage charges and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. However, after serving less than 2 years, he was released in exchange for a captured Soviet agent in the first ever U.S.-USSR spy swap. The U-2 spy plane incident raised the most tension between the U.S. and the Soviets during the Cold War. Being scared about how rapidly military technology by communist rivals in the USSR, President Eisenhower, who served in office from 1953 to 1961, approved a plan to gather information about sending high-altitude U-2 spy planes over the USSR in 1956, giving the U.S. its first detailed look at Soviet military facilities. Photographs taken by the spy planes revealed that Soviet nuclear capabilities were less advanced than had been claimed. Eisenhower realized that the U.S. had a much more advanced weapons than the Soviets. The Soviets were aware of the flights for nearly 4 years. However, the U-2 aircrafts were unreachable by any jet or missile the Soviets had. However, on May 1st, the Soviets had developed an air missile that shot down the U-2 flown by CIA pilot Gary Powers. Powers was taking a 9-hour flight that would have taken him from Pakistan to a landing zone in Norway. As Powers flew out over Russia, a Soviet air missile exploded near his plane, causing it to drop to a lower altitude. A second missile scored a direct hit, and Powers and his aircraft began to plummet down from the sky. The pilot managed to bail out, but when his parachute floated to Earth, he was surrounded by Soviet forces. Powers carried a teeny needle filled with poison in case a situation like this erupted, but for some reason he chose not to use the needle. On May 5th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet military had brought down an American spy plane, but he made no mention of capturing Powers. Officials in the Eisenhower administration responded that the aircraft was merely a weather plane and had accidentally flown off course. The Soviet leader quickly disproved that story and sent a photograph of the imprisoned Powers as well as evidence received from the wreckage that showed it was a surveillance aircraft. The U-2 incident occurred at a horrible time in U.S.-Soviet relations. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were scheduled to join a meeting with the leaders of France and Great Britain at the summit in Paris on May 14th. Days before the meeting, Eisenhower took responsibility for the spy flights and admitted that the weather plane story was a lie. But the U-2 incident had convinced Khrushchev that he could no longer trust Eisenhower and walked out of the meeting in Paris just hours after it had begun. Soviet negotiators also refused to talk on nuclear disarmament the following month. These events set the stage for further confrontations such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and Bay of Pigs, which all escalated the Cold War.